My body is a temple, so I'm told, growing ancient. A protected relic, a shrine to the hundreds of bold and terrifying women who, against all odds and gods, storms and sailing ships, rapes and sicknesses, birthed another and built up their child's walls to be stronger than their own. If my body is a temple, I will carve in it a statue of every one of those mothers of mine back to Eve, and they will stand taller and bolder and braver than me, stronger and softer and harder than me. But we'll all have the same eyes. And so when I sit across from my grandmother and I tell her my stories, she will look into my eyes and she will see the statue of her I am building. And she will remember how tall she is. Because my grandmother says she is shrinking, and so if her body is a temple, its four walls are crumbling. She shrinks under the weight of odds and gods, earthquakes and steamboats, and a dying mother who was gone before she had built up her daughter's walls. She shrinks under the weight of 58 years of marriage to his 80-hour working week. She loses a stone to every funeral of a friend, and to every subtle denial of her intelligence, and to every conversation about whether they're just waiting to die. She shrinks and she crumbles, but still her hugs envelop me. And I'm told my body is a temple, but none of the temples I've ever been to have been used as they were intended, and so I am a work in progress. I am built up and knocked down, forgotten for centuries, home for many, home for none. I survive earthquakes and remain a work in progress, and still will be when I am a grandmother. But her statue will remain painted in gold with the same eyes as mine. And so in every story I tell of her until I have crumbled too, she will be as tall as she felt before she met him. All right, so here's the idea. All of the people around you are storytellers. All of the people around you are poets. People with really different ideas about how they can live in the world around them. And your life is going to be infinitely better for taking the time and the space to listen to those. But we'll get to that in a bit. I'm not an expert. I've not saved any lives by flying a plane into a river or discovered a new element for the periodic table or anything like that. I'm just a part-time youth worker and a poet and a fairly friendly neighbour, and that's all I'm bringing to the table here. So if I was to analyse all of the TED Talks I've ever watched, I would say with a fair amount of certainty that I'm the demographic that runs the most risk of speaking a fluff piece. A lot of, emotional sounding words about, the meaning of life and the nature of humans, but not much in the way of practicality. But if I'm to value my own idea, if I'm to say that everyone around you is a storyteller and your life is better for valuing those stories, then it follows that I've got to value my own story too. And so here I am on this very nice red carpet. So I discovered poetry a little bit by accident. I was a bit broken-hearted over a few people and quite angsty about a lot of things, and I was crushing on some slam poets I had seen on YouTube, and so I was filling notebooks, writing lots and lots of stuff, when my friend said that she was hosting a poet from Australia and she wanted to put on a night of backyard poetry reading to welcome him. And so I opted to give it a go, and from that has born a lifelong passion for poetry. But the thing that surprised me most is the response people have to that. So most people seem to respond with the concept is But poetry is just like some art thing, right? It's just for academics or like hippies or people that recite Shakespeare in their spare time. I was surprised by this because I genuinely thought that everyone was a secret poet. I genuinely thought that my tie-wearing, marathon-running, office-dwelling father and the hard humans on building sites and my grandmother in between her sudokus and my neighbour on the porch were all writing poems, because how could they not be? But people looked at me as if I was a bit of a weirdo and went, I could never ever write a poem. But the thing is, I still kind of believe that everyone is a secret poet, or at least a secret storyteller, even you. And here's why. We live in a world that is constantly telling us stuff, and it is impossible to escape. You know, marketing and media and technology work at such a fast pace that it's so impossible to escape all of these messages. And so I reckon we could call this stuff the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is it's the idea that small children have, that a family equals mum, dad, 2.4 kids and a white picket fence, and that's it. It's the social media that boils our conversations and our stories down to 6-second Snapchats and likes and reblogs and news feeds and hashtags. It's our country's overwhelming support of the national men's rugby team, but no other national sport really. The dominant narrative is the reason that there's a boys' aisle of toys and a separate girls' aisle of toys in Kmart. The dominant narrative is the reason clothes in shops all look the same, and it's that burning desire to go to the mall even when you don't have any money. But who are we beneath all of that noise? Who are we in times of emergency, perhaps, or adventure, when the dominant noise isn't there? And how do we challenge that stuff? So let's call what sits underneath that the alternative narrative, and let's say that that's where our secret poet exists. Now, I reckon everyone has this alternative narrative, this secret poet bubbling away, but I think that people can sometimes go their whole lives without accessing it. So the idea is that we've got this secret alternative narrative under the surface. The reason to do something with this knowledge is kind of purely selfish. It's because we're going to be better off for listening to those stories and making space for those stories. You know, and I can tell you from experience that relationships become better and stronger. You become more connected to your environments. You can navigate traffic and more figurative concepts at a relaxed and gentler pace. And you become a hit at house parties. But it's hard, it's challenging, it's confronting, and unfortunately, or fortunately, it starts from within, which sounds fluffy, but I can promise you it's not. In fact, the reason it took me so long to do something with this knowledge is because, you know, making space for my alternative narrative sounded a bit obscure for my liking. So I spent a lot of time engaging with other people's stories without doing the work I needed to do on myself. But I came to this realization a few years ago when I was working as a checkout operator at a local supermarket around the same time that there were those rather large earthquakes. And it turns out that checkout operators are great people to tell all of your feelings to, because you've only got 3 minutes with them. They can't go anywhere. They're stuck there. And supermarkets are stressful places anyway, right? So I would spend these 8-hour shifts listening to people's 3-minute stories, and these people are anxious and stressed and hurt, and their stories are really hard and scary stories, and for 8 hours a day. And I'd come home feeling so overwhelmed and full of these stories of a broken and grieving and hopeless city. And then I realized that if I had taken the time and made the space for these alternative disaster narratives So my neighbours cooking me sausages on their barbecue at 5 a.m. after the September earthquake, and a city's newfound passion for local politics, and the gap fillers and pop-up projects that were happening. If I had made space to remember those stories and hear those stories and believe those stories, I would have been a lot more placed to hear the hard stuff. It wouldn't have meant that hard stuff wasn't there, but it would have meant that I would have dealt with it a lot better and I wouldn't have got so exhausted. So I reckon that once we start making space within for these alternative narratives, it becomes much easier to start taking them out into the world. Now, I started at my dinner table. When I was 14, I got my first ever romantic friend. Aside from, the kindergarten ones. It was super serious because we were like holding hands at school and our friends were teasing us, just sending love hearts to one another on Bebo, super serious. And the inevitable happened. My parents wanted to meet said romantic friend, and so they were invited for dinner. And I was terrified at the potential for seriously embarrassing or embarrassingly serious conversation that my parents might make. And so I announced to the table that we would play the dinner game. Now, there's no winners of the dinner game. All it requires is that we, in turn, say the best part about our day, the worst part about our day, the funniest part about our day, and then what we learnt that day. And by the time we had done that, dinner was finished. No conversations about anything else. And it's now become a 10-year plus long tradition in my family. It's always hilarious and sometimes frustrating and always wonderful. And it's taught me far more about my family than I ever would have having the conversations about the weather. And I'm not going to pretend that I started that out of a desire to, create space for meaningful storytelling. But the reason I carried it on is because I grew to value those stories hugely. And that's what I'm kind of saying, is that we don't have to make space that's too time-consuming or serious or even that poetic, but it does have to be intentional, which we come to the third space now. And the third space is our communities. And that's the biggest space, and it's also the most overwhelming, but it's also the one I'm going to talk about the least. And that's because I think that when we're doing that other stuff, when we're creating space in our own lives, it becomes natural to make those spaces in our communities. We don't have to do this by ourselves. You'll never have to do that by yourself. Those stories, those alternative currents are running underneath all of the time in your schools, in your neighbourhoods, in your workplaces. They're already there. It's about asking the right questions and then joining in. And so I remember, once I started writing, I couldn't stop. I had found this thing that I loved and made me feel safe, but it also made me feel challenged. And it made me feel like I was doing my little bit to fight back against that dominant narrative. And so it was about asking the right questions and finding the spaces to join in. And from that, so much has grown. And so in that backyard poetry night or in an open mic at a bar, I feel like I belong. So the idea is that the people around you are storytellers, and that we will become better people for creating space to hear those stories and really embrace them. I discovered poetry out of a desperate need to be heard and valued and to give those to other people in return. The dominant narrative in my life tells me that that is not what life is about. The alternative narrative, the quiet voice, tells me that that is living. And so there's 3 challenges for today. Here's the practical bit so it doesn't turn into a fluff piece. First, identify the dominant narratives in your life. Find the alternative ones and make them louder. 2, make the space for creative and meaningful storytelling. And that doesn't have to be time-consuming or even poetic. Around your dinner table, on the bus, in your workplace, with your family. Make the space for that. And 3, Meet someone new today. Find out what got them here, what stories brought them to this place, and what stories are taking them into tomorrow, and then share yours. I'm going to finish with another poem. If I ever have a daughter, I will dress her in rainbows. Later, when she's older, I'll let her pull her wardrobe apart and decide what to wear herself. And she'll go to kindergarten in stripes and spots, fairy wings and monster truck t-shirts, superhero masks and clip-on earrings, or a mixture of it all if she wants. I will make sure she is warm. If I ever have a daughter, she'll have a bookshelf in her room before she can read the titles. We'll bake cakes together, we'll sing terribly, we'll bang on pots and pans with wooden spoons. We'll play in the mud with a train set, with a soccer ball, with dolls, if she wants. I will make sure she laughs freely. If I ever have a daughter, I'll get rid of the television and we'll listen to Granddad's records instead. I will teach her that it is nearly always appropriate to offer a cup of tea, but that no always means no, and that she has a right to feel safe and to use her loud voice when she doesn't. I will make sure I always have time for her stories. Now, if I ever have a son, I will dress him in rainbows. Later, when he's older, I'll let him pull his wardrobe apart and decide what to wear himself. And he'll go to kindy in stripes and spots, camo and glitter, monster truck t-shirts and fairy wings if he wants, clip-on earrings. I will make sure he is warm. If I ever have a son, he'll have a bookshelf in his room before he can read the titles. We'll bake cakes. We'll sing terribly and bang on pots and pans with wooden spoons. We'll play in the mud. We'll play with a soccer ball or a train set or the dolls. I will make sure he laughs freely. If I ever have a son, we'll get rid of the television and we'll listen to Granddad's records instead. I will teach him that it is nearly always appropriate to offer a cup of tea, but that no always means no, and that he has a right to feel safe and to use his loud voice when he doesn't. I will make sure I always have time for his stories. If I ever am a mother, I hope I can teach my daughters and my sons what forgiveness looks like. Because if I ever am a mother, I will have brought a tiny and innocent creature into a big and terrifying world, and I will hurt them. I'll spend too long in front of the mirror sometimes. I will be so unconvinced of the goodness of the world sometimes that they will want to spend the day under the covers too. I'll talk badly about the neighbour, or my boss, or my own mother, and I won't remember to tell my daughter or my son just how much I love them. And so if I ever am a mother, I hope they can forgive me. Kia ora.